Hey loves, today we are reading Leslie's story. My boyfriend had his first sexual experience the summer before we started going out. He kept telling me stories about Sheila, who had put out the summer before, and how wonderful it was when he finally had sex. I managed to stay a virgin all the way through my senior year. I was dangerously close, I might add, but I stayed a virgin until the night of my senior prom. So the summer after graduation was my summer of being sexual. We had sex, and I use that term loosely, maybe 6 to 10 times. In August of 1965, I had gotten tickets to the Beatles concert in Atlanta, and we went out parking afterward and had sex, and when we came back to the house, I said, something's happening in my stomach. I feel like it's the 4th of July in there. What if I'm pregnant? I'm not even sure I thought of it before that. Denial is a wonderful thing when you're 17 years old. He went off to college, and I went to a local junior college within 6 weeks. And within 6 weeks, I was throwing up in the morning. We were talking back and forth on the phone. What are we going to do? I don't know. What are we going to do? Finally, he said, I'll come home next weekend and tell my dad, and we'll get married. I was madly in love with him, and it was a huge relief that he wanted to marry me. But I also felt this tremendous ambivalence. I'm thinking, I'm only 17 years old. How am I going to get married and raise a baby? So, to be honest, I really had mixed reaction. I told my parents, and it was horrific. I remember being so scared and shaking because I had always been the good girl. Of course, in that day, everything had to look right for the neighbors. You know, living up to the Joneses, right? It was such a huge thing. When we pulled up in the driveway after a date, if we sat in the car for more than 2 or 3 minutes, the front porch light started to flick on and off because what would the neighbors think you were doing out there in the car? The closest maternity home was in Mobile, Alabama, about 100 miles away. My mother couldn't get me out of town fast enough, but before I left, she told me that my grandmother had to get married. I was so grateful that she told me. That was a little present she gave me. You are not alone. I don't really remember the drive over. I know it was just my mother who took me. The maternity home was this huge old brick 3-story building that looked very institutional. I was terrified. I thought it was going to be like reform school. That's kind of what it is, except maternity style. I was so scared the other girls would be hoods. That's what we called kids with their sleeves rolled up and a pack of cigarettes and possibly a switchblade in their bobby socks. Kind of like the, if you guys watch the old, like, 50s, 60s movies, James Dean, Grease, the Greasers kind of style, that's what they're talking about. Not that James Dean was in Grease, but I'm just giving you guys an example. But when we walked in, I could hear giggling. I was totally stunned when I started meeting the girls. They looked just like me. They were college girls, high school girls, high school students, cheerleaders, the nicest of the nice girls. I was put in a room with 4 or 5 others, and one of them was a little girl the nuns called Little Bit. She was 13 years old, and she wasn't any bigger than a minute. The whole time that I was in that room, she cried herself to sleep every night. She was homesick. At the maternity home, the party line was, if you really love your baby, you will give it up. And again, this is still seen today, right? That's still the party line that bio moms get. You're doing a wonderful thing for a couple who can't have children. Again, nobody's entitled to a child, so they're constantly pushing this. Oh, but adoption's perfect for couples who are infertile. You're giving them a gift. Yeah, they treat us like commodities, and it's gross, right? Where were we? The baby would be called a bastard on the playground. Okay, sorry. It would be so selfish of you to keep your baby. And as long as you were going along with the party line, then you were with the group. But if you ever wavered or had second thoughts that you weren't going to be able to go through with the adoption, you immediately got separated from the pack so you wouldn't contaminate the thinking of the rest of the girls. Again, coercion, manipulation, they really dig this in, especially back then, but still today, where even society, we get these lines where, and again, it's so harmful to hear, well, your mother loved you so much that she, wanted you to have a better life, so she put you up for adoption. No, what happened was she was coerced and manipulated to thinking adoption was a better choice instead of getting support and resources, which is what she really needed. And adoption is not a better life, it's a different life full of trauma and long-term legal consequences. So, yeah. Sorry, you can hear my kiddo in the background. He's taking care of our kittens. I look back now and think, oh my God, that's mind control. That's brainwashing. But at the time, it was just seemed normal. And it's still somewhat, I'm not saying it's good, but it's, they normalize this thinking. Like, even when we call it out, people are disgusted that we call these things out. There's some people that are like, oh, wow, like, I didn't even know this, and thank you for bringing out the information. And then other people are like, why can't you just be happy for other people? Like, God, not every adoption's like yours. And we're like, I would say like 99% of the time, we're not even talking about our own personal experiences with our adoptive parents. We're talking about the trauma and the statistics and, the psychology behind it. And they're all about the rainbows and the butterflies and this brainwashing. Even society in 2023 is still very brainwashed with this idea. And it's disgusting. All right, sorry guys, I'm going on a rant today. Like if someone did something wrong, they just got put into solitary confinement. I would do anything they said if they had told me. Go to the 3rd floor and jump off the roof, and that's how you'll regain your parents' approval. Then that's exactly what I would have done. I had to get their approval back. So when we talk about fog, being in the fog, right, it's FOG. So yes, very much like fog as in, your mind is kind of like in this clouds and there's no clarity, but it's fear, obligation, and guilt. So it's that obligation part where birth parents feel obligated to their parents because of the approval, right? And then adoptees are divided because we feel both obligated to our adoptive parents as well as our bio parents, especially when we're in reunion. And it feels like we're being pulled in different directions and we're not allowed to truly express ourselves. So it's nice to have a platform, not just here, but on TikTok, where I don't worry per se what either side feels about, me and my own personal, like I'm very much out of the fog, right? It's a process. But I don't feel as much obligated to either one of them. I'm not going to say that there aren't certain things that, like, I'm taking care of my adoptive parents. They're older and my mom's very sick right now. So in that aspect, I feel obligated. But when it comes to calling out the harms of adoption, I call it out like I see it. I have these conversations with them. I had a conversation the other day with my dad, my adoptive dad. I don't talk to my bio dad, but he's still my dad, right? And he was, no matter how many conversations we've had, he finally asked, like, okay, like, I see what you're saying, but, like, what are the alternatives? So even though we've had these conversations, he even, like, didn't fully understand, right? So I explained to him the alternatives, and then he was like, okay, so what is the difference between the legal guardianship and adoption in that manner? And I explained to him, and he was like, oh, wow, okay, that makes much more sense that you guys advocate for that as a last resort, because he wouldn't want that stuff to change. I didn't need my birth certificate to be falsified and sealed. Well, it's open because of my state, but you guys get the point. I didn't need it to change to tell me that they are my parents. They're my parents because they raised me, and we have a good relationship because they listen to me. They're trauma informed. They are very supportive in ways that most adoptive parents aren't. Again, I recognize I'm in the 1% here, so please, I understand that. Most don't have that type of relationship. But they advocate for change. They advocate that they're proud of me in this manner for speaking out on the harms that are being done. Sorry about that. My kiddo was interrupting me for help with the kittens. So yeah, that's the thing is, it's not just birth moms that are in the fog, it's adoptees. And we don't really talk about the fog when it comes to adoptive parents per se, because it's not really an experience where they're in the fog. I don't know how to explain it. But often adoptive parents are not educated. They're not, informed enough. They don't do enough research and therapy to recognize these points. So I guess you could say that they're slightly in the fog, especially when it comes to the fear. Not so much the obligation, but the fear aspect of it. I've had some comments where I've seen where people are like, well, if I was an adoptive parent, or, I'm an adoptive parent, and I would never allow the bio parent to be near the child because they give them up, or I'm afraid that the child would want to be with their bio parent instead of me. So it's that fear that they're not being seen as a parent. Their obligation is always going to be to the child, but often when it comes to fog, it's in a selfish manner. And then the guilt, if they're informed, they do tend to feel guilty that it depends on the situation. I can't speak for many of them with the guilt aspect, to be fair, but when they are getting this information from us, at least in more recent years, especially on TikTok and stuff, I do see that they do feel guilty about playing into this role. And my thought process is, if the legal process is already done, it's done. You can't undo it, right? Unfortunately, you just can't. I'm not saying take the child away or anything, but you can't just go and redo you can get readopted, but you can't undo an adoption. So there's that. But what you can do is learn information and try to be as best adoptive parent as possible. And again, even then, it's not going to negate the trauma or the long-term consequences, but you can try to do the best that you can to support that child. So I do see some guilt, but not in the same way that birth parents and adoptees feel. But, in the Primal Wound, she really does talk more about the adoptive parent side. Again, I don't cater to adoptive parents or hopeful adoptive parents. So if you're out there and listening, I do appreciate it. But the reason I don't cater is because there's so much information out there that already caters to APs. And yes, most of it is not adoptee or birth parent centric. And that's where I'm focusing. You know, if they're coming in, if you're here and you're listening, I appreciate it. Like I said, to get your information and to do better. But my goal is to help fellow adoptees, and even birth parents that are listening, but mainly adoptees, because we lack the resources that is needed. And anyone else along the way, I do appreciate all the support that is here. All right, continuing on. All right, my mother gave me her wedding band from her first marriage so I could wear it when I went out in public, which she basically wished I would never do unless I put a bag over my head. We'd go out in little clumpets. I'm sure everybody in the world knew we were from the maternity home, but we'd all walk around with our wedding bands on like we were just as normal as could be. My favorite nun was a big tomboyish woman from the Midwest. We loved her, and you knew she loved you. On one of our outings, we went to the Humane Society and got Sister 2 puppies. Oh, that's so sweet. I didn't know how she managed, but she convinced the nunnery that we needed the puppies on the premises, and they kept them. All right, I shouldn't pause here, but animals are really, really wonderful therapy tools. Like I said, I have cats. We have 4. Oh my God, they're a pain in the butts. I love our babies, but animals really are a great therapy tool. There are prisons that do this too, not as many, and I wish they did, because I think it would not only help out a lot of shelters, especially the overrun ones, but it would also help with the prisoners, and there really is an adoptee and foster care, former foster youth to prison pipeline, which is something that we do need to talk about. But animal therapy is a wonderful, wonderful thing. It doesn't have to be a dog. It doesn't have to be a cat. There's, horse, there's equine therapy if you have access to it. If you like reptiles, work with reptiles. If you like rodents, work with rodents, But just animals in general are fantastic creatures that are so in tune with our emotions without talking back. They're cute and lovable, and it's just a wonderful tool. So often when I tell people that are infertile or, looking to adopt, and I say, no, go to therapy and get yourself a dog or something, I mean that in the best of terms, because both of those options, so I'm just going to say it. Animals, I have 4 cats, okay? 2 are 11-week-old kittens currently, and I've had them since they were 8 weeks. Taking care of cats is much more complicated than taking care of a newborn baby. All right? These babies are wild. Or get a reborn doll or something, But it just also helps with the therapy aspect of coming to terms with the grief. So that's what I mean on that. All right. Sorry, I went on a huge rant with that, but I think that's wonderful that this particular maternity home had the 2 puppies. There was another nun who was the counseling nun, and she wasn't more than 25 years old. She would come once a week. She was a social worker nun. That was my first inkling that maybe if I survive this, I could help somebody else. Maybe I could be a social worker and be a compassionate ear to somebody else who was going through difficulties. I was terrified to give birth. I'd never been in a hospital. The sister took me over and pulled up in front of the hospital and let me out. At 17, I went in and admitted myself. They wouldn't allow your parents to come until the baby was born. I don't know why. I had to labor in the hall. Ooh. I couldn't be in the labor room because all the women in that room were married. Finally, they pulled the gurney into a room and gave me something, and the lights went out. I remember absolutely nothing about his birth. The next thing I remember was my parents standing over the side of my bed. They were smiling and crying and said, "What did I have?" And they said, "A little boy." When I came back to the maternity home, I got to visit with my baby every day. I would feed and rock him, and when I looked at him there in my lap, staring back at me, was the birth father and me. I could see both of us in that child, plain as day. Losing my relationship with the father was hard, too, because 17 or not, that was my first love. And when you have a child with someone, you have a connection for life. All right, I'm going to disagree on that last part. I have a son, as you guys know. Yes, we are connected in life because of my son. But I don't feel that love. It's only a slight obligation so that we can co-parent, if that makes sense. But in terms of like connection for life, it's going to end at 18 in terms of communication, unless it's absolutely necessary about the kiddo. But our son always comes first. Always. So, and again, co-parenting is not easy. Trust me, it's not easy. I remember little snippets of having to go to the courthouse to sign the papers to relinquish my son. My mom says she went along, but I don't have any recollection of that. I had to sit in what was like a witness stand, and the judge was behind the big desk with a gavel. I remember him saying over and over again, "Do you understand you can never go back on this? This is irrevocable. Once you sign those papers, you can never see your child or have any contact with your child. Do you understand that?" He reiterated it in 2 or 3 different ways, but I was so scared. Okay, so again, this was during the times when open adoptions didn't exist, and even, so open adoptions didn't start till the late 1980s, early 1990s, right around the time that I was born. And even in today's world, there is no legal binding of open adoptions. There are a few states that claim that they are now doing legal binding, but they have yet to have a lawsuit where they side with the biomom. So I want to make that clear, okay? Like, just because they say it doesn't mean that it's happening, right? I mean, adoption's human trafficking in all sense of the word. There is money in exchange for a child based off race, ethnicity, gender, health, location, right? That is human trafficking, but because it's under adoption, it's legal, right? So it doesn't mean that it's gonna happen. But to say that you can never see your child or have contact is disgusting. They absolutely can, and they should. But as we know, reunions do happen after the adoptee is typically around 18 years old. I'm sure I signed the papers, and I don't remember. I got to visit with him one last time, and when I was holding him, his little eyelids were flickering, and he was smiling, and Sister said he was dreaming of angels. I never got any copies of the papers that I signed. I asked my mom years later if she had any papers put away, but she didn't get copies either. I do remember coming back from the court, hearing and squeezing myself into one of the beautiful dresses that I had made at the home. I remember being all mixed up, being sad, but kind of excited to get out, and terrified to see my friends. All those emotions were mixed in there together. The first few weeks at home, I cried all the time. I'd lock myself in the bathroom or go to my room. I cried all night. But I didn't let anybody hear me because I felt like I was being bad. I wasn't doing what they said I was supposed to do, which was get over it, move on with your life, and put it behind you. I thought, crap, I can't even do this right. I remember standing at my bedroom window at night, looking for my boyfriend's car to drive by. I finally just said, just stand and look out that window. All right, so we don't talk enough about the grief that the birth parents feel. This is often heard, back then, a little bit more compassion, not as much, but some compassion with birth moms now. But I mean, really, the birth mom is grieving, as we've heard, that she's not the only one that felt that way and cries. But the child, who the baby is pre-verbal, has pre-verbal trauma, is grieving the loss of the bio mom, and it's not being recognized. It's not being recognized by the adoptive parents. It's not being recognized by the social workers. It's not being recognized by the adoptive parents. So it's really frustrating. Finally, I talked my parents into letting me see my boyfriend one last time so I could tell him about the baby. We went out and, it was heaven on earth. I could talk about it. We cried together, and I told him what the baby what the baby looked like. He said we can get him back. And I had to keep telling him, you don't get it. There's nothing we can do. I signed him away. So she's correct. There's literally nothing you can do. You can't get the baby back unless you readopt him. Which sounds wrong because, if that's their birth parents, people were probably thinking, but that's his birth parents. Why would they need to adopt him? Because there's no way to undo an adoption. There's no way to dissolve an adoption beyond rehoming. So yeah, isn't that fantastic? We also can't get emancipated as adoptees. Fun little fact, huh? Anyway, I had a much lower profile once I was back at home. I made preparations to go away to college. My mother found this little Catholic all-girls school for me in northern Alabama. I wouldn't have to worry about who knew and who didn't. So there was some relief in that. I had been gregarious in high school, and I had lots of friends. But when I went to this school and tried to going to a few mixers with the boys, I was just all nuts inside. I couldn't make conversation, and I couldn't wait for the bus to come and take the boys back to their school. Then in January, I got a phone call from a fellow I hadn't heard from in probably 2 years. He was my boyfriend from the 9th grade until my junior year. He was getting shipped to Vietnam. He and another friend from high school had enlisted in the buddy system. They were going to Nam, and they wanted to blow it out before they left, before they got their hair cut off. So they came for the weekend. I fixed his friend up with my best friend, and we drove to Birmingham and got 2 rooms in the seediest motel you ever saw. The idea was the 2 girls were staying in one room and the 2 guys in the other. We were going to get drunk, but we were going to go to bed in our respective rooms, which I think, in fact, we did. Okay, so this is where, just bear in mind, she does not remember things, so we're going to continue on. I remember drinking Rebel Yell and Coke, and I got so drunk I didn't know my name. I have snippets of memories, but I don't remember a whole lot of the evening. I was with people I really enjoyed, but I was anxious, so I got drunk. The voice on my head was going, "Do they know? Do they know?" One of the snippets I remember is being on the floor in the motel room with him on top of me, making out. I think the other couple had gone off to the other room. I remember thinking the only reason he came out to see me was because he heard about me. I'm sure that's it. He heard I put out. Then thinking, what does it matter? I'm not a virgin anyway. What does it matter? So bear that in mind. Trauma on top of being drunk. Yeah. I woke up in the morning in my room with my girlfriend in the next bed. We were all hungover to beat the band, and they took us back to school and left. I hoped I hadn't had sex with him. And this is, she was essentially raped. She was raped, but she has yet to come to terms with it, according to this book, or at least according to this interview. But 6 weeks later, I got up one morning and I threw up. I knew immediately I was pregnant again. I just felt frozen. I literally started shutting down. When my mom came to pick me up at the end of the semester, I slept on and off in the back seat of the car. I remember lying back there thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What is wrong with me? I mean, you could forgive someone's first pregnancy. How in the world could you ever tell anybody you did this again? You can't. So I ate like a madwoman. I gained 70 pounds. Lucky for me, it was the era of tent dresses and muumuus. So I made myself dresses and I ate everything that wasn't nailed down. Mother would lecture me, "You're gaining weight. You used to be such a pretty girl." I drank a whole bottle of castor oil to induce labor. Okay, so getting into this next paragraph. First of all, if you are pregnant, never do that. Bad. Don't do the castor oil thing. Second of all, she's trying to either cause a miscarriage or an abortion. This was before abortion. We're talking about decades before Roe versus Wade, so abortion wasn't really a thing. And so it's, black markets. If they had the money, they could find someone, but we're not talking about families that are wealthy here. Bless you.
Thank you.
And a few times when my mother and grandmother went out together, I stood at the top of the stairs and threw myself down. All that happened was I got black and blue. Over the course of the summer, I would go out to visit my sister, who lived a few miles away. And there was a really sharp curve on the road. And I remember thinking, I really have to unalive myself because I can't tell anybody. And I can't go through this again. One time, I got up to 120 on that curve. And then it occurred to me, they'll do an autopsy. And they'll know I'm pregnant. God, I can't even get out of this life without anybody knowing. Then one Saturday, I was at work and I didn't feel good. So I went home around lunchtime. I just had these horrible cramps. I thought, maybe I'm going to have a miscarriage. I'll have a miscarriage and nobody will ever know. I was upstairs in my room and my grandmother was downstairs. She was a big football fan and she was cussing at the television. God damn you, get a touchdown. I was upstairs holding onto the bedpost because my stomach hurt. A little later, I went into the bathroom. I got into this crouch position over the bath mat. I just gave birth to my son. He looked at me and I looked at him, and neither of us made a sound. I pulled towels down from the rack and wrapped us up and drifted in and out of sleep. My mom came home from work and said, "Are you okay in there?" And I said, "No, I'm not." I had locked the door. This, which was never allowed in my family. No locked doors. It's a bathroom. She's allowed to lock the door. Jeez, people. She said, "Let me in." And I said, I will, but I have to tell you something first. She said, "Okay." I said, "There's a baby in here with me." She said, "Okay, just let me in." Years later, she told me she thought I kidnapped a baby because after I gave birth, every time I saw a baby, I started to cry. She thought I had slipped a cog and kidnapped somebody's baby. Of course, when she opened the door, she saw that there was blood and he was still gooey, and we were still attached by the umbilical cord. She called our family doctor, and the minute they took him away from me, he started crying, and he never stopped. They took him down to my mother's room, and he cried, and he cried, and he cried. So this is the pre-verbal trauma that we're talking about. Even though she's only in the next room, he's wanting mama, right? All he knows is mom. She needs that baby. But agencies and not bio parents, but like these grandparents and these social workers and adoptive parents don't recognize this pre-verbal trauma. They don't recognize the signals that the baby is giving off. Where were we? I was in my room, putting a pillow over my head and trying to get the sound away. I was so full of shame, I couldn't look anybody in the eye. I still struggle with that at age 56. I begged my mom not to tell my grandmother, and she said, "Leslie, we've got to. There's a baby here." The doctor said, I have to register the baby as a live birth. I remember my mother being horrified because she knew somebody who worked in the Vital Records Center. He said, "I love you, honey, but I'm not going to lose my license over this." My son cried the entire night, and it was just more than I could hear. The doctor's wife called the next morning to see how we were, and my mother told her that it had been pretty rough. So she said, "I'll come take the baby until you can take it to the agency." The baby is a human. My God. I delivered on a Saturday, and I was back in school the next Monday, wrapped in foam rubber so nobody could see how quickly I lost the weight. My parents wrapped me in layers, and every few weeks we would take a little more off. I remember my world turned gray. The light sources just shut off. I felt like I was in a dim world. I begged my mother to take me to a psychiatrist, which she did in a few weeks. We had to go to the next town because then you would never let your license plate be seen at the office of a psychiatrist. So again, this is still back in the days where seeking help was not seen as good. I mean, even in today's world, there's still a lot of people who deem therapy as bad, but it's not bad. There's different types of therapy, as we talked about, but it's not a bad thing. So I just want to be clear about that. He saw me twice. On the second visit, he gave me antidepressant medication. I started to take it, and my mother saw it and flushed it down the toilet. Because that was the era of, bite a nail, honey. So that was the sum total of my therapy. It's like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, as if that's really relevant or helpful. I finished the year of school. I had my little sports car, and I worked in the Villager store to get more Villager clothing. I went off to the University of Georgia the following year, but my life was never the same. I joined a sorority, and I distinctly remember one day we were all out on the sidewalk, during rush, jumping up and down like a bunch of fools. I felt like a total nitwit. I'm thinking, these girls don't know what they're in for in life. I just felt like I was playing this humongous charade. A charade I continued. I never told anyone about it. I sealed it off. I laughingly called myself the born-again virgin because the country was now having a sexual revolution. It was Vietnam, hippiedom, and everybody was having sex like bunnies. Real out in the open. Not this girl. I just kept putting on a lot of weight. I stayed very heavy. I had 1 or 2 boyfriends, but it would begin to get serious. I'd either eat more or get rid of them. I didn't have sex again until I was about 23. And believe you me, I had been on birth control for several months prior. As an adult, I got my buns into therapy. I worked hard at it, but I never told anyone outside of therapy that I was a birth mother. I had a best friend who was a supervisor and a mentor, and one night she told me that she had surrendered a child, and I said, "Well, sit down." And that was the first person that I ever told that I had 2 children. The first time I said it in a room full of people was when I was in my late 30s in group therapy. I always felt like people would be totally repulsed by me, that they would run from the room. After all, I didn't just do it once, I did it twice. But I got nothing but compassion from the group, and I was so stunned by their response that I couldn't walk out of the room. My legs were like jelly. 2 other therapists had to help me out to the car. It's been a very slow journey. Every time I tell I get better, and nobody's left the room yet. That started me down the path of talking about it more openly. My husband and I had twins after we'd been married a couple of years. We went through IVF. I thought I was going to die if I didn't have a child that I could raise. Yet, I kept picking all these lousy relationships. I finally found my husband, and I knew he was a good, solid guy. People always ask, did he know about this before you got married? I'd say, you've got to be kidding me. That was the part of the litmus test. After I gave birth to the twins and settled down into a routine, depression started creeping in. Every stage they went through, I realized the stages that I had missed with my sons. When they talked, when they walked, when they cut teeth. It just became so real. I got more and more depressed, and I was having a hard time getting close to my twins. I would have a panic feeling that something was going to happen, and I was going to lose them. If there was a kidnapping or any harm to a child, I'd start crying and shaking, and I had to turn off the TV. I mean, it was a little over the top. I was frightened of losing them, that I kept on an emotional distance. So I got back into therapy, and I worked on learning how to attach. Then I had a dream that I was driving down the street. The same type of curve when I thought about killing or unaliving myself. And there were these 2 little toddler boys sitting by the side of the road. I thought, oh my God, they're going to get hit. So I stopped the car and I put them in the back seat and I said, I've got to find their mother. I relayed this dream in my group, and a woman said, so when are you going to look for the boys? I started reading everything I could get my hands on, and I called Concerned United Birth Parents and talked to my district person. I remember saying, but you don't get it. You don't get it. I have 2 kids. She said, honey, we have workshops for women who gave up 2 or 3. There's a conference in a few months in California. You've got to come. I said, there are other people who gave up 2 children? I went to my first Cub conference. I don't know where we got the money, but I got on this plane and looking at everyone thinking, could she be a birth mother? Could she be a birth mother? I forgot to ask what they did at these conferences. A van picked me up and another birth mother's son was driving. The other guys in the front seat turns around and says, what do you do at these retreats? And I said, I haven't a clue. Never been to one. I didn't even ask. And the son of the birth mother piped up and said, they cry a lot. They cry and they cry and they cry. And on the way back, I said, boy, were you right. But instant friendships were formed, and it was like I came out of a deep freeze. I felt like Rip Van Winkle. God, where had I been? I'd been through this women's movement, and I got militant about everything except this. I began to see it as an incredible women's issue. And again, this still is happening today, so we are still, Roe versus Wade is a women's issue, access to abortion, access to health care, access to, the right things that we need for pregnancy or for our periods, having support and resources to raise our babies, family preservation, all this thing. It's still a huge women's issue. It's a human rights issue, really. But continuing on, my husband has always said he put one woman on the plane and an entirely different one came back. I became the chief social worker for one of the hospitals in town. Those were the days of hospitalizing teenagers who acted out for really long periods of time. In the beginning of the 80s, it started to go the other way. 28-day treatment for substance abuse, but before that, people could be in the hospital for 3 to 6 months. I was the head of this unit, and one of the things I kept noticing about the admissions was how many of the teenagers were adopted. I thought, my God, could I have done more damage than I thought? There was nothing in my college training about adoption. Adoption was what happened at the agency. It was an event. It wasn't a psychological anything. I hadn't learned anything about it. I think it's in the best interest of the public to learn a whole lot more about the consequences of adoption. There are repercussions for this little societal experiment for all of us. You don't just pick up a baby from one place and graft him onto another. It doesn't work that way. This false view that society has of adoption is still costing an awful lot of people of a lifetime of pain and regret. They thought they were protecting people. They were protecting the adoptees with all this secretiveness. They were protecting adoptive parents from any disruption, and they thought they were protecting a girl's reputation. That was all part of the secrecy. But it made it all the more shameful, and it ended up hurting people. We were all kept apart by the system, and it was very unhealthy. Sometimes when I meet birth mothers who fought tooth and nail for their babies, I feel so ashamed of myself that I didn't have the fight. How does a woman separate from her own flesh only by disassociating? I don't think there's any other way you can do it. I met one woman who wouldn't sign the papers, and she was put in a mental institution by her parents and kept there for a year until she signed. I thought, oh God, why wouldn't I have been that one? So again, these birth parents lack support and resources, and it's terrible. Anyway, I will see you guys Wednesday for Chapter 8, The Aftermath.